Hello, and finally, welcome to episode 270 of the Huntsman Hill. Let's just call it the Huntsman Hill podcast tonight. It has been a while since we have been with you all, and it is exciting to be back. It has not been without its challenges. Myself, Rodney, and Glenn have all been steeped in life and just lots going on, and just have not been able to figure out a schedule to record. You know what? This is 271. I forgot. There was a Black Sabbath episode that I did with Dave a couple of weeks ago between this one. Sorry, 271 is this episode. But excited to get back with the regular power trio tonight. However, as Rodney and I were promptly on time for the recording, Glenn is a no-show. So we are hoping Glenn is okay. We are assuming Glenn is okay with something hockey related, but Glenn is not with us. It is myself and Mr. Hill. We have desperately tried to get this episode together, so we're not going to wait any longer, and we are finally getting to R.E.M. But before all of that, Rodney, how are you?
As they say, the band must go on. And, you know, when you're the two original band members, you got to dig deep and make it happen sometimes, even if plans don't go the way you thought they were going to go. So I'm doing great. Nice to finally be back on the air. Yes, indeed. We have been doing our due diligence to get this on the air, and it hasn't happened. But hey, as you said, life happens. This is a wonderful thing that we enjoy doing, but you know, we all have other things going on in life as well. But it looks like we're finally going to get to 1982's Murmur.
Finally, yeah. Look, if Hall & Oates tambourine player doesn't show up, Hall & Oates still do the show. So here we are, Daryl Hall and John Oates of podcasting.
You calling Glenn the tambourine player?
It's the best I can do off the top of my head. He's important, but is he that important? I don't know. I'm kidding.
He is, but he's making us question him. No,
he is.
Totally joking about that, of course. But cool, man. Well, let's do it to it as two.
Let's do it. I desperately want to talk about our R.E.M, so I'm excited to do that. We have, I think, both been to a few shows prior to this recording, because there has been a gap since we last spoke. Last time we spoke was a month ago. A month ago almost. When we talked about Steve Albini. Lots of follow-up thoughts to that I won't take time really here to discuss. I know you and Glenn went to Punk Rock Bowling. You and I talked a little bit before we hit recording. Sounds like you guys had a great time, but nothing super specific to talk about there. But I did want to talk super briefly about Echo and the Bunnymen, a band that you saw in Colorado, that I saw here in Los Angeles just last week. And just because, I think they're an important band of this podcast, kind of. I don't know why I feel that way, but I kind of do. And a band that I have dug really deeply into recent years. And as I have started to play music myself that isn't either metal or punk, a lot of the stuff I play is kind of sounds like a distant relative of Echo and the Bunnymen and has become a big influence. So, and a band that you turned me on to once upon a time, or at least you're the, I don't know if you turned me on to them so much as you're the first person I knew that owned Echo and the Bunnymen records. And I know this is the first time after all these years you've finally gotten to see them. So I just, we don't need to spend too much time about it, but wanted to just get your impressions of how it was seeing, Ian and Will and the boys.
Well, it was, I literally have been, I have been trying to see this band since I was a teenager in the 80s. So the fact that it was 2024 did feel like some sort of like accomplishment or conquering something, even if it was just, the fact that it was finally on a weekend instead of a weekday. But yeah, it felt nice and sweet to finally be able to see a band that I not only have really, really enjoyed for my entire musical life, but a band that I maybe listen to now more than I did back in the day growing up. So that was great. It was really fun to go to a great venue in Denver. The Ogden Theater is fantastic. I've seen countless great bands there. And to be around, people of my age and maybe even a little older than me, for sure, a little older than me, that have a true appreciation for this band. You and I talked a little bit before we got on the air about it, and we had our little complaints about certain set lists and things like that. For me, and especially because I don't have anything to compare it to, because I literally finally saw the band for the first time. I was pretty enamored with them. It was great. I'm sure that there have been hundreds and probably thousands of great and better Echo and the Bunnymen shows before I saw them in 2024. No doubt about that. But I was happy with what I got to see. I thought Will Sargent was great on the guitar. I thought the whole band was really good. It was very enjoyable. When you go to shows with older people, you can get 10 feet from the stage and freely move back and forth to the bathroom in the bar and all those things as well. So it was a really enjoyable night. If I could have seen Echo and the Bunnymen in 1987 and 97 and 07, it would have been much better. And 17, all of those things. But I didn't get to see him till 2024, but it made me happy, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself.
Yeah, that's a really good recap. I'm totally with you on Will Sargent, man. I love that guy's playing so fucking much. He's so great. You said something before we started recording that I should remind myself of, and it sounded like was true of both shows that we attended. They sounded fine. They were good. What was really good was the crowd and the atmosphere and the reminder of the community around this music that we love, whether it's Echo and the Bunnymen in our respective cities, whether it's you attending Punk Rock Bowling, whatever. It's being around those people who love the same thing that you love and kind of celebrating it. That's part of the experience too, not just how tight the band was or how good the singer sounded. So from all of those things, Echo certainly checked the boxes.
Yeah, well put, because it's been well documented here on this show that I don't get to go to nearly as many shows as you guys do. So yeah, to have that, there actually was a little camaraderie. Like when I think of camaraderie, I think of it more about being at like Punk Rock Bowling or shows like that, like where there's like a niche group of fans. But there were plenty of people that were, well, basically the whole crowd was super passionate about a band that they've dug essentially their whole adult lives. So that was that. You're right, and that was fun. And I certainly did analyze the band and their playing and their set list and all of those things. But it was fun just to go and be amongst your peers and sing along and have a good time.
Yeah, totally. And there's something about I always push up against nostalgia, and I struggle with it in a lot of ways, and as a sign of getting older, as a sign of getting complacent, as a whatever. But there are times like that when you can appreciate that thing that you all appreciated when you were younger, brighter versions of yourself, and that's it's cathartic's not the right word, but it's communal, I guess, is the word, so that
I would say cathartic and communal.
Yeah.
I'd say both of those.
Yeah.
But it's also when I just got done saying that 2024 is not the time that you dream about seeing Echo and the Bunnymen for the first time. But the fact that the band still brings it, we both had our kind of complaints, and we nitpicked a little bit before we got on the air. But the fact that they're still playing a pretty good set list of some pretty damn good music and sounding pretty good. Like, it's not, I don't feel for a single second. I have my little, we discussed that. I don't think for one single second those guys are like bored and doing it for the money kind of thing. Like, I feel like they still enjoy playing their music, or at least it seemed like it to me.
Yeah, I would say it this way. I would be surprised if they weren't doing it for the money, but I don't think that they seem like they're washed up or disinterested. I think they are probably better on different nights, and I wouldn't hesitate to go see them again based on what I saw the other night. Like, I'm sure they have good nights and better nights. Um, it's just, sometimes it feels inspired and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes that's because of the crowd, and sometimes the band is off, and for whatever it is. Um, but I don't feel like Echo and the Bunnymen are done, and I will go see them again. So the nitpicks are exactly that's exactly what it is they were nitpicks.
All right. Well, glad. I wish we could have seen that show together, but I'm glad we got to see it within a week of each other. So.
Yeah, man. Yeah, man. Same. All right. Well, let's go from one 80s influential, important band to another. As mentioned, we're talking about R.E.M. tonight, a band that it seems criminal that we've talked about U2 and I don't know, the Chili Peppers and pick your band that that doesn't matter really to me anymore before we talked about R.E.M. A band that kind of does matter to me still, but I think I'm just realizing that again. So I'm very interested to have this conversation. Being 271 episodes in before we talk to them about them seems a little crazy. But here we are, and I'm glad we're finally here. Let me do a little calibration for as much calibration is needed for a band as successful and popular as R.E.M., but let's do it anyway, just because we've never talked about them before. R.E.M. was formed at the University of Georgia in Athens in 1980 by drummer Bill Berry, bassist Mike Mills, guitarist Peter Buck, and singer Michael Stipe. Their first single, Radio Free Europe, backed with Sitting Still, was released on July 8, 1981. The single was well received, and it led to a record deal with IRS Records, who we've talked about just recently on the show when talking about some of the latter Black Sabbath years. Miles Copeland, Stewart's brother, running that label and signing R.E.M. The first release for the label would be the Chronic Town EP, which was released in August of 1982. The EP's lead track, Wolves Lower, received moderate radio play, and the band went back into the studio 4 months after its release to begin work on their debut album. Paired with future Pet Shop Boys and New Order producer Stephen Hague, those sessions did not go well, as the band was unhappy with Hague's perfectionism and his want to add keyboards to their arrangements. Making their case to IRS and asking to be reteamed with Chronic Town producer Mitch Easter, the original sessions were scrapped, and they re-entered the studio in January 1983 and re-recorded the songs that would become Murmur 6 weeks later. The album was released on April 12, 1983, the same month as Bad Brains Rock for Light and Minor Threats Out of Step, making it a watershed month for alternative music. Murmur would reach number 26 on the Billboard chart, and a re-recorded version of Radio Free Europe would be released as the album's lead single, released on July 8th, 1983. Exactly 2 years to the day of that song's original release. Murmur would go on to massive acclaim as one of the most important alternative rock releases of all time and be listed by numerous publications, including Rolling Stone, Spin, Pitchfork, Blender, Q, and Mojo, as one of the greatest albums of the 80s. So that is the very short history of R.E.M. leading up to the release of their debut album. Rodney, talk about your history with R.E.M. I said that weird. R.E.M. in general and Murmur in particular, man. Do you remember the first time you heard them?
I would love to. This is actually Phil's kind of a unique niche in our podcast, in that, from the get-go, the whole point was to, talk about older records and how they've stood the test of time or not, all that, a music retrospective where anyone that's listening gets that idea. This one's interesting in that, we've talked about records that are so old, like Stooges records and, Black Sabbath records, things that Led Zeppelin records, things that either preceded my birth or, being able to actually learn about records on my own or whatever. Okay. This one is unique in that it precedes me ever owning a record or a turntable, which is fine because we've also discussed about things where we had cassettes when we were kids or whatever. But this is in this unique little period when I was old enough to be curious about interesting music, but got it on. Well, I'll go ahead and give a shout out to my own mom. At one point, so I'm guessing late 82, early 83, she was like, I don't remember even if it was my birthday or Christmas or something. She was like, why don't you make a little list for me of music that you like, and I'll go down to Tower Records and see if I can get a hold of it. So how cool is that? Like, I talk about not having any siblings that were into music. My parents weren't really all that into music, but this is one little thing, one little time when I was like, all right, cool, Mom. And I made a little list of a couple things, and lo and behold, whatever it was, perhaps my birthday in 83, I'm not sure, I got a cassette of Murmur. And I absolutely loved it. To go back one half step to what you said, the first time you ever heard it, I know that I had heard it on early MTV, probably on K-Rock, maybe so sort of a simultaneous thing. So specifically the song Radio Free Europe, I should say. Not like the whole album. MTV wasn't playing the whole album, and I don't think I was hearing on any station anything but Radio Free Europe. But that song in particular grabbed a hold of me, so much so that I was like, yeah, I want to check out this band. Not someone else telling me, well, other than the media telling me, but not like a friend telling me like, man, you gotta dig AC/DC because they're so great, or, whatever. Like, me sort of hearing something in my own ears and going, this sounds really interesting and appealing to me. I want to check it out. And like, this is really one of the earliest examples of that. So I did acquire the cassette and learn to love this record via cassette, and we can go from there.
Do you remember what other cassettes you got in that time frame?
I knew you were going to ask me that. Well, one was the one hit wonder, the Romantics, with What I Like About You, which is a great song. I still love hearing that song every time I hear it. But unfortunately, their new release, where they were all wearing like pink suits or something, my mom got me that one because that was the new one, and it didn't have that song on it. But I still actually was okay with that cassette too. I can't remember the third one though. But it was Murmur, the Romantics, and gosh, I'll see if I can think of it while we're recording. But Murmur was the hit. Like, it was everything I hoped for. Because we talk about it back then, not having a big collection. Like, when I got something, I listened to it from track one to the end of the, in this case, cassette, every time. And like, maybe there's some examples, like, actually, I think Diary of a Madman, I think I played Over the Mountain over and over and would reverse it and play it over. But for the most part, I really did listen to records or cassettes from start to finish, So that was maybe a tribute to this record being good start to finish, and also just discussing how we sort of did it in those days. Like, yes, this is called an album. Like, this is meant to be listened to. So I did listen to this thing from start to finish, essentially every time.
Yeah.
On cassette.
I have to drop an anecdote just because you brought up the Romantics. I have been so newly infatuated with them in recent months about how legitimately good they were. I think they're an example of a band that was actually hurt by MTV because they looked and dressed so goofy. I think the Smithereens are like this too, where their songs are actually great, but their image was a little lame and it hurt them. So much so that I wrote a song last year that the guitar part sounded so like the Romantics that I called the songs the Romantics. going to be the first song on the next record Mid-City 3 is putting out. That's how into the Romantics I have been lately.
Wow, well, I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, me too.
Them and the Smithereens, both really good sort of garage, neo garage rock bands that maybe didn't quite get their just due.
Great songs, man. Both those bands had great songs.
But so another thing that I was struggling with as I was doing my research over the last, well, I would say week, but really month, and that the word, and you mentioned it twice during your sort of intro of alternative. So it feels weird to me to what we know now and what R.E.M. became as a massively nationally successful band to like refer to them as alternative. But I absolutely did. Even like, past my super young years as when I was listening to this on cassette, but in their next like 2 or 3 or 4 albums that followed Murmur, I don't know. I struggled with the word, like, is that alternative music? But that was very much different than anything I was listening to and anything that was certainly on top 40 radio, but even on most interesting radio. So it seems weird to look back and use that term acceptably about R.E.M., but I gotta say it did feel like alternative music to me.
I'm glad you brought that up and agree with everything you just said. And when I wrote that little intro, I wrote alternative rock in quotes both times that I wrote it. And I debated, like, do you call this modern rock? Do you call this post rock? But alternative rock is what we called it, which, to your point, seems crazy now. I mean, R.E.M. has more in common with, the Byrds than they do with Gang of Four. So weird, but they certainly were. My experience with the band, or at least my introduction to the band, is later than yours. The first R.E.M. record I ever owned wasn't until 1987 when Document came out, and then I sort of worked my way backwards. I'd certainly heard R.E.M., but I was so steeped in, capital
God
M
knows
metal.
what.
Yeah, that I wasn't, my mind wasn't exactly expanded in '83 to this stuff, and I was kicking against it if it wasn't loud and screamy. But became obsessed with them, and then went backwards and became a hardcore fan for the rest of their careers. So
I also loved that the whole thing with Athens was more closely associated with what you would think about for like punk and metal of a scene in a town, right? Like we've discussed that a whole bunch on this show, right? And I always loved that R.E.M. never felt like, I mean, they were a band that made some really great music that got immediately had their arms wrapped around them by the media and by larger culture, right? But it always felt like they were very much like a part of a scene, and that felt alternative. I mean, there were a lot of good bands from that scene. Pylon comes to mind. I used to have an old VHS tape, and I wish I could remember all of the bands that were on that. Barbecue Killers, I think. Pylon, a lot of bands that never, amounted to anything commercially successful, but it felt like they were part of the scene. And knowing that, well, I mean, to, jump ahead in the story a little bit, I'm married to someone who lived in Athens for a while. So later than this, although she still overlapped with R.E.M. a little bit there, but we could talk about that later. But that it felt like a scene of people that enjoyed playing together and enjoyed each other's music. All the good things about alternative music, right? So I always gave them credit for that, where they came from and how they sort of handled it and respected it.
100%. And the thing about Athens that always struck me, you mentioned Pylon, who were great. Obviously the B-52s and R.E.M. were kind of the two big success stories. But if you just think about those three bands alone, wildly different, more like the 70s CBGB Lower East Side New York scene, where you had Ramones and Television Blondie and Talking Heads that all sounded completely different, versus the Lower East Side hardcore scene, where all those bands kind of sounded the same.
Well, I was even going to say like, or 70s Los Angeles for sure, and San Francisco, where people took pride in how different they could sound from one another, but support each other. So,
Right.
so I guess in that sense, if you looked at it as sort of like a post-punk scene or an alternative scene, it really was in that sense, right? Like you had people that were more into each other and how their interesting bands sounded and how different they sounded or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that is a basis for a lot of the respect I had for REM from the get-go, I would say.
Well, and I think your point that, well, maybe not your point, but the point that this scene was in Athens, Georgia, not in San Francisco, not in LA, not in New York City. Like that
Hmm.
is one of the things that, it's like Raleigh, it's like these little towns, and Austin became a bigger thing, but Austin was a town like that too, where it's like, these very small scenes that no band had any business in believing that they would be able to break out of at the time. But they, to your point, made music because they loved it. They weren't trying to become rich and famous. They were just playing music because they loved it, and the scene kind of snowballed from there, which is just really, really cool when you think about how small comparatively that scene would have been.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Always with any good scene, it makes you like look at it from afar and go, I wish I was a part of that.
Yeah.
I wish I was there
Yeah.
experiencing that, So
Yeah, it's funny. I often lament that there wasn't more of a music community where we grew up. I mean, I played music and stuff, but there wasn't a community of musicians really, and it's so big, and there was so I don't know. It just felt different than I imagine an Athens would have felt like.
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, to my point about wishing you were there, like there's so many, I could go on and on about so many great scenes over the decades that
Mhm.
I'm like, I'm kind of I thought it was great to like grow up in a massive, metroplex where every single band that ever toured came through and all of that, and you could buy any record you wanted to, but being part of that interesting like connectivity and scenes, you know, that would have been rad.
Well, and I think what you get, when you think about just DC as an example, you get the guy that owned the Yesterday and Today, that kind of famous DC record store that they all went to, or Inner Ear, which was, the studio. It's like there was one record store and there was one studio and there were like two clubs. And because it was so contained that if you were a fan of music, you all congregated at the same place. It's not
Yeah.
like you had, Bionic or Vinyl Fetish or Bleecker Bob's, or, we had, Zed, and we had dozens of options, whether, record stores, venues, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
so you had Murmur. Talk about how your relationship with REM developed from there. How into them did you get? Did you keep buying their records? Did you see them back in the day? I don't even know the answer to that, actually. I'm not sure we've ever talked about it. So just like,
Yeah, I strangely I didn't have hard copies of their ensuing records. REM has always been a band to me that they have so many songs that I truly dearly love. Um, as a result of us sort of getting into different music, like we used, like, in 1982 or 3, this was alternative to music to me. We got into some pretty extremely alternative music in
Mhm.
by the mid and late 80s, like as we became friends and stuff, right? Discovering, all different genres of punk rock and metal and things like that. I was always an REM fan, and I have my, I can go through the list right now. I mean, Fall on Me, Swan Swan H, their cover of Superman. I can go on and on and on of songs that I love by them. Driver 8 is Driver 8's a song that I could listen to 1,000 times and never get tired of,
Amen.
ever,
Yeah. Fall
ever.
on Me too. Yeah, they have a
Yeah,
lot of those kind of songs. Yeah, they have
exactly.
a lot.
They have a lot. They have a lot. And I think it was only my exploration of like sending my antenna out to experience everything in the world that REM may only have gotten a little bit left behind.
Sure.
But not much. I mean, I was always a fan. I bought Document the day it came out. You know, I got to. We'll talk about this later. I only saw them once, and it was not until the Green tour. But my being a fan of REM never stopped.
Never
I
wavered,
just
yeah.
was listening to a whole lot of other different things.
So were you always buying their records? Like each record you have?
No, I did not. I did not buy every single record. That's it. I have a sporadic collection of REM records. And you know, another thing was we've talked about with a lot of bands that I grew up in the K-Rock era. You could hear that band many times a day, all day long.
Right.
So
right.
I didn't like always, and which of course that's a rip off of the band and of their records and of how many good deep cuts that you're never going to hear on the radio, right? But there's just something about when you hear a band constantly, you don't feel like you gotta go, you know, buy that record tomorrow kind of thing.
Right.
So that, you know, and that has nothing to do with the band that they were sort of being played to those heights. But so that was sort of my relationship. Never stopped being a fan. Didn't delve as deep into them as I kind of wish I would have, because I was listening to other stuff.
Sure. When would you say, maybe not ever, but I'm wondering, did your fandom veer off at any point? Like, did you get into even their latter day records before they broke up, or did you taper off somewhere?
I definitely tapered off. It's a good question, and it's a hard one to answer. Monster was undeniably a really good record. You know, I don't know if it was just the fact of how well it was received that
Out of time.
Yeah. Yes, Out of Time. But Automatic for the People, that's some Athens, Georgia geography right there. There's a soul food restaurant called Weaver D's that's, you know, that picture on the cover is, and there's some great songs on that. I think there's even some points in time, like, you know, okay, I'm like, Shiny Happy People. Is that a good song? But then Kate Pearson sings on it, and you're like, yeah, it's fucking great. So you don't like Kate's voice as much?
I love her
voice.
like I really don't like that song. I actively dislike that.
Well, that and there's a couple more from that era that kind of turned me off a lot. Stand. As a geographer, stand in the place where you look, now face north. Stand like you know, that's actually probably the R.E.M song that drives me nuts the most in a negative way.
Yeah.
So yeah, some songs where I'm like, and then, you know, through no fault of the band during that Out of Time era, when it sort of felt like the media was like, these guys are overdue for their just appreciation, which perhaps is true. Now we're gonna pile it on them, like give them as much accolades as we possibly can, when, as we talk about so much on this show, that a lot of us go like, man, but their earlier shit was so much better. You know, there's forever and a day will always be that situation, right? When you're like, a band was really good, and now their stuff's not nearly as good as it was, and people can't just praise them enough.
Yeah, I'm gonna slightly disagree with you. I totally agree with the hype and the praise that was. It definitely felt like time that everybody said, okay, it's time to appreciate REM. Everybody, pile on. That I totally agree with. But I think their music stayed pretty great. I mean, Automatic for the People might be my favorite REM record, and really close to the top is the record Up. That was the first record they made without Bill Berry, which is fucking incredible. And look, I mean, Murmur, Reckoning, Life's a Rich Pageant, and Document, those records in particular, fucking amazing. But that mid period and even some of the latter records are pretty great. So I don't know that I wouldn't necessarily say their older records are so much better, but I would say where the fuck have you all been? They've always been this good, you know?
Yeah, I will say this, that what I was saying, even about the earlier records, that even the ones I didn't dive deep into, there's so many really good songs on those. I would say that stayed true throughout their catalog, right?
Yeah,
Like,
sure.
even though you're obviously a little more appreciative of their later stuff than me, um, they it wasn't like a band that we were like, who's this band? Like they were, well,
Right.
you know, this band was amazing in 1986, and like, what have they become? That never
They never
happened.
got shitty. No.
It never got shitty, and there were always really good songs on every record they ever released, even if I didn't, you know, dig deep or as appreciate them as deeply as you do.
Yeah. Well, you know, I had a fall off too. I mean, the record I mentioned, Up, came out in 1998. That was the last one that I know really, really well and absolutely loved. They put out 4 more records after that that I really don't know at all. I mean, they've got a pretty deep catalog. And the thing that sparked my want to do Murmur tonight was that I don't know what sparked it, but a newly kind of reinvigorated interest in REM. And I started listening to them again a few months ago when, you know, they were a band that kind of went dormant for me for a long time. Like I hadn't listened to REM in forever. And something maybe it's because I bought a 12-string Rickenbacker. That's probably what did it. And just loving that sound.
Yeah.
And
I
digging
know what did it for me. It was marrying a girl from Athens, Georgia, later in life.
Okay, so
so
that's what I was
so
gonna ask.
REM never slipped away from me. Like they still got on the turntable a little
Okay.
bit. But when you have someone that, like, you have some commonalities in music, but she has a true passion for that band, well, then of course they're gonna get more airplay, and you're gonna listen to them
Okay.
in a different way. You
That's
know.
what I was going to ask you. So you never, I mean, even if you didn't get into as much of their later stuff, you never slipped away from REM. They were always kind of at least medium rotation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
Okay.
sure, for
Okay.
sure.
Do you remember,
Um,
or, I mean, not specifically, but is Murmur one of those records that gets sort of regular play and you know super well?
Murmur is the one that gets the most play. So after my cassette collection had long gone away to wherever it went. Um, I never had a copy on vinyl, but till, like, I don't know, sometime in the 90s, or probably the 90s, I
Yeah.
was like in a record store and was like, you know what? Here's a sealed copy of this record for $10. Like, this record's so good that it has to be in my collection. So I re-upped on that.
Yeah.
And that's the copy that I have right here.
For
So
sure. For sure. You know, it really struck me because we talk about this a lot, right? Is, you know, we talk about bands we love on this show obviously all the time, and new bands we're just checking out or whatever. And even bands that we deeply love, when you start to analyze them to talk about them on a podcast, you discover new things and you think about the music and the songs a little bit differently because you're academically kind of investigating them. The thing that really struck me with Murmur, and then listening to other REM stuff, you know, in the weeks since we decided to talk about this record, is I've been listening to this band for decades. We've both been listening to this band for decades. Um, and I'm a big lyrics guy, and I'm a big sing along with the record guy, and I know almost all the lyrics to a lot of my favorite music, and even music I like passively, I know all of the lyrics to. I don't know any REM lyrics, man, except for the choruses. And, you know, Michael Stipe famously kind of mumbles and often sings indistinguishably and kind of makes up words and whatever. But outside of the choruses, I know almost none of the words to these songs.
well, and I think also everything that you said, but also I think a little intentionally ambiguous.
Yeah, that too.
Right, which he always struck me as a person as being sort of intentionally ambiguous, right? Like, well, and everyone in this band, you don't know too much about them. Like,
Right.
you know a little bit about them, but and I find his lyrics to be that way too, right? So it's for example, we touched on like one opposite of that, I would say would be Fall on Me, which I think is an environmentally conscious based song, right? So buy the sky and sell the sky. Like I can sing along with that because I can relate to that and I know what he's talking about. There's a whole lot of lyrics, like vocals that I love, but lyrics I'm like, man, I don't know what's going on. So, and that's obviously the way he wanted it to be. But yeah, same. Other than choruses, I'm like, let me ask you this question. Prior to living where I live now, I had almost zero, if any, interaction with people from the South growing up. I mean, we grew up in Southern California. I mean, come on. So musically, I that's why it sort of felt alternative to me. It felt like something different than I had listened to before. But I think as far as like standing the test of time, like when I go back and listen to this, this definitely feels like a style of some sort of American music, whatever term you want to use. Things get overused, like Americana, which that term didn't even exist when this record came out. But right, but that's always appealed to me a little bit about this, that I don't feel like anybody, like, even though we had like the whole post-punk cowpunk scene and stuff where people were getting into roots rock and American music and stuff, this still felt different to me. This felt like people playing this were from a place that I wasn't.
Really well said. This is, I'm only going to say this probably because I've been listening to them a lot lately. But another band of this era that does that to me is the Meat Puppets. Is that they sound they're playing a style of music just like R.E.M. that is familiar, but it sounds like of a place that I can't exactly identify. Even when you think about obviously country artists sound geographically of a place, and that place is easy to identify. Or dub or reggae or hip hop or lots of styles of music. R.E.M., to your point, I think they do have this really interesting amalgamation of that Wire, Gang of Four, post-punk thing, but also the Byrds, Southern California jangle pop thing, but also some country influence that is a down south kind of that Americana, what would become Americana thing. They feel like a real melting pot of their influences, which I think is really cool and which made them unique. And and they sound, the way the songs ended up coming out are like super pop radio friendly, but they have all this disparate influence.
Yeah, totally. And even I almost forgot to bring this up. The pretty interesting record cover, right?
I love it so much.
So in the background, a railroad trestle, but completely inundated and overgrown by something that you and I never heard of ever, kudzu.
I'd never heard of it until I was preparing for this episode.
Kudzu is because I have, over the course of living where I do for decades and have a lot of really close friends from the South. They're like, never heard of kudzu? I'm like, no, we don't have that on the Pacific Coast. They're like, yeah, it's an invasive species which just grows like faster than any plant that you've ever seen and just overtakes things. For a while, I remember my friends, there was like a jam band or some band that came out for a while called the Kudzu Kings. And my friends were so stoked on it. They were like, that's incredible. And I was like, what's that mean? And they're like, you wouldn't understand. And I'm like, you're right, I don't understand. But so even the cover is like a field of this thing that I didn't hear about for
the place.
20 years after this record came out did anyone explain to me the significance of what this cover means, you know?
Well, and now it seems like it was kind of an inside joke. Like those who get that, those that are of our community will immediately recognize this.
Right.
So yeah, I had no idea what it was, and reading about it for tonight, you know, the definition that I read of it is that they call it the plant that ate the South. And it is a weed which grows so rapidly and aggressively that it overtakes an area that it grows in and kills off all other plants around it, which is pretty metal.
Yeah.
Kudzu with an umlaut over the U should definitely be a metal band. In fact,
Perhaps over both U's.
both U's, yes. I'm gonna steal that. That's amazing. Yeah, and apparently they that trestle that kudzu is pictured in front of, apparently that's become a historically preserved site because it's on the Murmur cover, that they were going to tear that down some years ago and preserved it.
Yeah, I think they even like built a different like rail route, but
yeah,
that.
I think that's that's right. That's right.
So there you go. That's your
yeah. That is cool.
But yeah, so very much, even if it's in subtle ways, this really just feels like music of a certain time and place, and a certain time and place. Well, not a time, but a place that we didn't grow up in, but that it's fun to experience. And even when I go back and listen to this record today, it still sounds, I mean, how many bands have been influenced by R.E.M, and how many bands, you know, R.E.M's, that sounds no longer an alternative rock sound, but it still holds its place to me. Like it still feels like a really interesting place and time, to its credit.
Totally agree. And I think you pointed out the word alternative is the right way to think about this, is because there is nothing exotic sounding or alternative sounding about R.E.M, but there used to be, you know, like they were doing something unlike how anybody had done it before in this very obviously radio friendly way, because they became massively popular. But
yeah, and as we get into the discussion of the record, I mean, so glad that they held their ground. It didn't want to have a producer. They wanted to throw keyboards in here. Like, come on. Like there's a couple spots where there's strings in here, and there's like, it's just so much more rich and warm feeling than if you'd have just gone with the instrument of the day, which was the synthesizer, or, you know.
Well, and yeah, and you probably read this when you were reading about the record too, but one of the things that sort of broke them when they were working with Stephen Hague was how hard he was on Bill Berry getting the drum tracks exactly right. You know, he had to do like, you know, dozens and dozens of takes to get things perfect. Yeah, and R.E.M is a band that you don't want to sound perfect. You know, they're not the Pet Shop Boys. The part of the jangly kind of looseness, they're like the replacements. I think are a pretty good comparison actually to R.E.M. You know, that sort of, they're not a drunken bar band, but they're kind of this great bar band. You know, and that looseness is part of what makes them great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Athens has been and still is, but certainly at that point in time, a loose bar town.
Yeah.
You know,
sure.
like.
I'm sure. Yeah, I feel to coin a song, I feel like I should take a pilgrimage to Athens some point just to pay respect. You know, I've never been that way, so I got to do that.
Yeah, just once for me, but.
So, okay, should we dig into the record a bit?
Let's do it.
Okay, so you know, here we are at that moment, Rodney. Track 1, side 1, Radio Free Europe. What say you?
It's a track 1, side 1. Let's see what Rodney says.
As I already said, this was specifically the thing that led me to this band. Not uncommon that a band's single would, like, you know, get you into it, but to this day, when I listen to this record, when I listen to this band, I will never get tired of hearing this song either. It's so well written. It's so, and actually one thing that just came to my mind is that as much as we just got done talking about their interesting sound of a time and place and of Athens, Georgia, and all that, this song is so well crafted and has so many great hooks to it that it could easily be like a band that reminds me of this would be like the Plimsolls from LA,
Ooh,
right? Like
good
sort of
one.
an Americana band, but that just writes something that is just so good. So I think the rest of the record, I will go back to what I was getting at about their Athens sound and all of that. This song is so good, it almost transcends all of it. Like this sounds like it could be from where we grew up. Like it's just I don't want to belittle it by saying it's a great pop song, because it's a great pop song, but it has God, everything just from the simplicity of just that drum intro of and then the ascending, like I think bass line, is it bass and guitar, like like it's just so good. But there's just so many interesting parts to it, man. It's what drew me in, and it's still one of my very favorite R.E.M. songs.
Yeah, man. I'm really glad you brought up the Plimsolls, and this is going to be slightly blasphemous because I love the Plimsolls. But the difference between the Plimsolls and R.E.M. is, I would say, A Million Miles Away is as transcendent and is as good a song as Radio Free Europe. But the Plimsolls never did that again. They have a lot of other great songs.
The Plimsolls never grew beyond being a kind of a bar band. And Peter Case certainly did as a solo songwriter. Although I will say that, it's the Plimsoll stuff that interests me the most. But yeah, that's sort of where the comparison ends, right? Is that the first two Plimsolls records are kind of almost made me feel the same way as R.E.M. in a West Coast way. But that's where they stopped, and R.E.M. kept going and made 10 more records.
Well, yes, but even so, even if you take the first two records, and look, I love the Plimsolls, so I don't want this to be a slam of the Plimsolls, but A Million Miles Away is transcendent. R.E.M. has a dozen songs that are as transcendent as Radio Free Europe. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. Yeah, the Plimsolls have 2 or 3. R.E.M. has at least a dozen, if not more.
Yeah.
Anyways, that was kind of a tangent that just came to my brain. But talk about not just a lead-off track, but other than their initial EP, the lead-off track to their career, what would become their career, right? It's the first song on their first LP.
And their first single, right? The first single they released,
and the first single, all of that. Like, I mean, and an absolute perfect choice, perfectly executed, introduces you to the band, and then you dig deeper. How many times do you hear a great single, but then you're like, oh, the deep tracks are so much better? And there are some great deep tracks on this record, which we will get into. But an absolutely fantastic lead-off track for your debut LP.
Yeah, it's a perfect song. The band
it is kind of a perfect song.
Yeah, the band does credit it's that way too. That they in interview. I think it was Bill Berry again who said, he credits Radio Free Europe with all of the band's success. Like that, that was the first single that got them signed to our IRS. That was the single that got radio play when Murmur came out. That that was the song that changed their fortunes, their lives. Which is pretty cool. This record, as good as that song is, and as good and as much as we praised on it, the quality of this record does not taper. I don't know if there's a better song on this record than Radio Free Europe, but there's
some that are close.
Yeah, real close.
Going back to and we're obviously going to discuss it as we talk about each song, but the decision to stick with their guy, Mitch Easter, as the producer, there's a lot of reverb on this record, but it's very subtle. Certainly on the vocals, on the drums, it's so well executed that makes it sound like an interesting record to me. right? That maybe back in the day when I was that young maybe that's why it sounded alternative. There's a production level on this record. It's very nuanced though. It's very nuanced. There's not like a big echoey part but there's just certain parts.
Well, maybe that's what sort of makes the record timeless, maybe, is that the drums do have a lot of reverb on them, and they do sound of a time. They do sound 80s because of that. But Peter Buck's guitar, again, the super jangly Birds thing sounds like the 60s.
Right.
So they have these
well, you
kind
talked about them blending their influences and their time periods and styles. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, and now as we start to dig into the rest of the record, it looks like we might have a guest joining us. And look who's here.
What's up, boys?
Mr. Polanco shows up an hour and 16 minutes into the show. Look at him. Hey.
To be fair, he wasn't actually flying the plane, but
yeah, I was out your way, buddy, Rodney. Somewhat. So in the same state.
Yeah. Well, welcome back.
Thanks.
Were you listening to R.E.M. on your earbuds on the plane?
I was not. I listened to it several times last week, and then we had to postpone. But yeah, I didn't have a chance. I was on the phone pretty much the whole ride home, catching up with the wife about stuff. So
about hockey, I'm sure.
Yes, definitely hockey.
All right. Well, look, we're well into the conversation here. We just finished track 1, side 1, but I want to derail us just a little bit, Glenn, to just get your, we're just gonna ease you into the conversation midstream, I think here. But I want to just take a quick step back to just get your quick history with R.E.M. I don't want to prolong it too much since we did a lot of this at the top with me and Rodney, but I just want to hear about, your experience with the band in the early days, how much you've listened to them in the subsequent years, and then what this record sounded like to you when we decided to talk about it a few weeks ago.
Yeah, so I don't know when I got into R.E.M. Probably in the 80s, maybe in high school. I always loved Life's Rich Pageant. That was, I think it's an amazing album. I did not listen to this one as much, but was still familiar with it. Obviously, the hit track, I don't have it in front of me. Radio Free Europe was like, everybody knows that song. And yeah, I've always kind of had I don't know, maybe like I like Midnight Oil and stuff like that. I think obviously Green, that record blew up and had tons of hits and stuff like that. So yeah, I've always appreciated R.E.M. I like kind of their political stances and stuff like that, activism, I guess, that Michael Stipe had taken throughout the years and stuff like that. Yeah, I really appreciate this band.
It seems like a band you should like a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I probably, I don't know. I guess I've listened to them throughout my life, but I just never really just dug deep into it. Like, they've always just been very cool, and like I said, I really appreciate them, and their music is easy to listen to, and yeah, I mean, they're just a good alternative band.
So you weren't out there buying the records, and you don't know a bunch of the deep cuts or whatever. Is that fair to say?
I mean, I have Life's Rich Pageant. I have Green. I might actually even have this record. I just didn't listen to this one as much. That Life's Rich Pageant is the one I always go to, just because I love certain songs on that one. So yeah, I didn't dive as much into this one. So it was nice to kind of listen to it. It's all kind of the same to me, like this and that album. Like they're all pretty similar. Just have that R.E.M. Style, and yeah, it's easy listening to me.
We've touched on Fall on Me and we've touched on Superman. So Life's Rich Pageant has been at least peripherally touched on a little bit during the conversation. Rod, it's interesting. Glenn, you immediately used the word alternative, which plays in nicely to kind of the context of the conversation so far. And the ease of listening has been a theme as well, of like, they're just so easy and good that it's hard to disparage this band in any way. But what did they sound like when you put Murmur on to listen to for tonight? How long had it been since you'd actually put on an R.E.M. record, and what did this one sound like when you got back to it?
It sounded. I mean, it's just like another, a sweater you like that you haven't worn in a long time. It's just so easy to listen to. That kind of that guitar style that they have, where they're kind of like, I don't know what you call it, but they're playing and then they're kind of picking and doing this kind of, I don't know what that's called, but
guitaring.
It's guitaring, as I said in other episodes. The guitaring is familiar, and I just like that style. Yeah, it was easy. I mean, obviously starting off with the title track is like, I've heard that song forever, as far as I can remember. And then, yeah, as far as, I mean, were they not one of the probably first, I suppose, like college radio alternative bands that kind of
Blew up? Yeah.
When you say that genre or term, does not this band come up immediately in your mind as one of them? I think so.
I'm glad you said that. We actually haven't used the phrase college radio or college radio rock yet, and you're exactly right. This is the very first band I think of when somebody says college radio.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
Glenn, was that a Kenny Cargilla connection with you at all? Because I know from that same time period, bands like Midnight Oil, The Church,
for sure, Midnight Oil. Yeah, for sure, Midnight Oil. I remember Kenny had 10 through 1 or whatever. That was that, and I love Diesel and Dust a lot. But yeah, I don't remember if R.E.M. was one of them. Probably, honestly, but I'm not 100%.
All right, just curious.
You mentioned The Church, Rodney. I'm going to see them next month.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, they're playing with the Afghan Wigs.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, good. You're up to speed, Glenn. So thanks for your take. Yeah, I appreciate the analogy of the analogy or metaphor to your favorite sweater. Although I don't think I've ever seen you wear a sweater, so I'm not sure how much of a compliment that really. If you said your favorite hoodie, I might have understood your appreciation for R.E.M. a little bit better. All right, we just talked about Radio Free Europe, and it sounds like Rod and I have at least a longer relationship specifically with this record. We were making the point, Glenn, that as good as that song is, and we agree that it's an all-time classic and just a great song. The quality doesn't really dip when you get into Pilgrimage Track 2 or Laughing and into the record In Earnest. So, I have a lot to say about this record, but it's only really continuous praise and more positivity. So I'll leave it to one of you guys. Where do you guys want to go on side one?
Well, I was going to say straight off, I mean, obviously Radio Free Europe is just undeniable, but my 3-song sequence is the next 3 songs, actually, Pilgrimage, Laughing, and Talk About the Passion. I mean, those 4 songs in a row are just it's just a great listen, you know.
Let's talk about how good this record is then, because and specifically side 1, my favorite 3-song sequence is Talk About the Passion, Moral Kiosk, and Perfect Circle. So we've pretty much we said Radio Free Europe is an all-time classic and a perfect song, and the next 5 songs on the record are part of our 3-song sequence. So that speaks to the quality. Perfect Circle, which is the last song on side 1, is my favorite song on this album. I absolutely love that song. And interestingly enough, I don't know, Bill Berry for some reason has been the main member of the band that we have spoken about tonight, and he is the drummer, and he is the primary songwriter of Perfect Circle. So it's the slowest, kind of quietest song on the record, and I just think it's just kind of a perfect song, which is this great chorus. And man, what a great song, and what a great side 1. Rodney, what about you on side 1?
Man, the tracking is so perfect. It really feels like a complete side 1, and I wouldn't change a thing about it. Yeah, everything is Laughing. I've got to give a little shout out to Mike Mills. Laughing is at least a little interesting bass intro, right? Yeah. So nothing like, over the top or wild, but it just that he gets his little moment in the sun there, I think. But yeah, those tracks, I guess I Talk About the Passion is always one. When I think about this record, that's one of the choruses that always comes up to me and gets stuck in my head. So, good on that for Michael Stipe, but, absolutely unequivocally, my halo on this record is the song Moral Kiosk. I love that song. That feels like everything I loved about, we just, again, talked about like their connection to the South and Athens and all of that, but also like, Radio Free Europe, I feel like Moral Kiosk is like a early 80s, almost new wave song, like not new wave really, but that I could totally dig, like, sounding like that could be from any West Coast band anywhere, talking about the reverb that we discussed. Certainly the vocals have the reverb, but the drums have some reverb on them too. That to me has the other, we all know about Radio Free Europe. We just got done talking about it, but maybe the hookiest song on the whole record for me is Moral Kiosk. That when it goes to the break and just that whatever Michael Stipe is saying, like you said, I don't even know what Michael Stipe is saying. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. To me, like that has this probably the sweetest ring in my ear of any song on the record. So I'm a massive fan of Moral Kiosk, and that was listening to the record, as you said, like analyzing it a little deeper for this episode. I probably got most excited about hearing that. I love that song.
Me too. And you mentioned Michael Stipe or Mike Mills. Moral Kiosk has the kind of the really sweet backing vocal on it. And Mike Mills is sort of the Michael Anthony. A lot of mics in this section. Is kind of the Michael Anthony, what Michael Anthony is to Van Halen, which is a great bass player, but really like a killer background vocalist. Mike Mills is to R.E.M. Like his voice coupled with Michael Stipe's is just kind of French kiss perfect. What else on side 1? Anything, Rodney?
Literally the whole thing. Like it's and as you said, Perfect Circle, like closing that out. It's just perfectly tracked, like even tempo wise, right? Like it's I don't know. I have no complaints. But I've spoken solidly about my 2 favorite tracks by far.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys feel the same way. And the side 1 is kind of perfect. Side 2 is great too. I don't think side 2 is as good as side 1. Um,
Yeah, I
uh,
don't think so.
it closes for me really fucking strong. I think the last 2 songs in the album are absolutely great. And everything in between is really good too. But I mean, side 1 is just so incredible that it's kind of hard to compare, I think. But you guys feel any different or anything on side 2?
I can't make the argument that side 2 is as good as side 1. It's not, but I do kind of like it. One thing that I enjoyed on these couple listens is that there's not a single, quote unquote hit for me on side 2, but there's not a miss either. Like, it flows together so nicely without sort of relying on, I'll be honest, when I'm listening to, Talk About the Passion, it's a great song, but I kind of can't wait for Moral Kiosk to come up next. Side 2 just sort of flows together nicely and completely. So
yeah.
I got to give it that.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Go ahead, Glenn.
Oh no, I it's so weird. Maybe for some reason so like Pilgrimage and Talk About the Passion got double asterisks for me. And I pretty much did that for the entire first side, except for Moral Kiosk. So it's interesting that your Halo. Maybe I need to go back to that and actually listen to it a little bit closer.
It's okay to do an episode where we don't agree on everything.
Yeah, I know. But
And Moral Kiosk does have a very specific energy. Like, I love that song, but I could see where that song might like I could see somebody not loving that song because it's kind of very unique.
Yeah, and then honestly, I start the 2 songs with asterisks on the second side, so it's interesting. You also like kind of the end of it. I like the beginning of it, and then the only other song on side 2 that I happened to bookmark was "Shaking Through" because I like that song as well.
Really interesting. Shaking Through is my lose. I like Shaking
Giving
Through.
it away.
That's how good this record is that we can have those differences of opinion, and there's really not a song on this record that you couldn't identify as like one of your favorites, because that's how good the record is. What I will say about Shaking Through is it's kind of one of R.E.M's earliest hints, or really definitive earliest hints, Rod, at that thing we were talking about earlier, which is that kind of very specific country twang. And a lot of their later records, and specifically Automatic for the People, would lean heavily into that. But it really kind of makes itself most well known in that song, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, I love the whole tracking of this. There's not a single song on side 2 that I would probably ever put on like a mix or anything. But I loved listening to it from start to finish. To agree with Glenn, Catapult's just a good jangly, sort of brings back up the energy after side 1 ends in a very mellow way. Catapult kind of brings back up the energy. Sitting Still, was that was the only thing that even like slightly challenged my Halo of Moral Kiosk. I forgot how much I liked that song.
Yeah.
But it continues through fantastic. I mean, literally start to finish for me.
Yeah. Sitting Still was the B-side to that original Radio Free Europe single we talked about.
So you're right. Right.
Really old one.
That's
for them.
a good choice.
The only song I would on the mixtape or playlist selection, the one song I would certainly do that for is West of the Fields, which is the last song on the album, which kind of has a similar vibe to Bob Seger's Hollywood Nights, which is a song I love, but has that kind of driving energy. But that song rules. And then the song before it, We Walk, it's got like a waltz tempo, like a very, dun, 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 which is a complete departure from anything else on the record, which is so cool.
Well, I like, how often I complain that like the unique song is left for the last one, right? Or the weird one, or whatever you want to call it. Right. I'm so glad that they didn't do that with We Walk, right? Like, this is the weird waltz song that doesn't sound like anything else, and we just stuck it on the end. They don't. It's the second to last track, and than West of the Fields, which, as you said, is kind of interesting. Dare I say, galloping.
Yeah, totally galloping. And We Walk is so weird. It's got 5 verses, and each verse has the exact same lyrics. So it's really kind of got this repetitive, this back and forth, almost metronome energy to it that's kind of hypnotic and cool. But you're right, it is kind of the quote unquote weird song. But it doesn't end the record because they pick that up with the much more sort of propulsive West of the Fields, which is awesome.
Again, well tracked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Anything of the 12 tracks that we missed that you guys wanted to touch on?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Well, let's do it. And I know it's often challenging and sometimes not something we want to do, but let's do Keep One, Lose One. And I'll start since I already gave away my lose, which would be Standing Still. And that's not because, that would be Shaking Through, which is not a bad song. It just happens to be the if I have to pick one, that's the one. And then my keep for sure is Perfect Circle, just because I just absolutely love that song. Glenn, what about you?
I think my keep is going to be Pilgrimage, and none of us really was it 9-9 or whatever. Maybe that's my lose. I didn't write anything on that. I can't think of it in my head how it even went, but I figured since none of us picked it or said anything about it, it's probably not
fair.
On the top.
It's a good rationale. Rodney, what about you?
I'd love to go with something like Moral Kiosk or something that has a deeper meaning to me on the record, but there's absolutely no way in hell that this record is what it is if Radio Free Europe isn't on it. So I know it's the real obvious. I want to be more clever than that, but I gotta go with that as the keeper because that has to be on this record. For my lose, it's kind of interesting. Coincidentally, it's the same as Glenn, but for a totally different reason. I don't think that song that I always called 9-9, I don't know, maybe it's 9-9, I'm not sure. That's not the worst song on the record. But the only time that I ever saw R.E.M. in my life, which is also the only concert that I've ever seen at the Fabulous Forum in Los Angeles, which was on the Green Tour, it was sort of a last second, like, hey, we got an extra ticket, you want to come? I'm like, yeah, of course I'll come see R.E.M. Somebody in that group of 4 was like just a drunken, annoying person. I just didn't really associate him with him the whole time at the show, except for when the encore came up. And when there's 15,000 people cheering and stomping their feet for R.E.M. to come on, it's okay to like shout out like your favorite song or whatever, even though there's not a chance they're going to hear you. But if you scream over and over for 10 minutes straight when no one can hear you except me, 9-9, 9-9, 9-9, I can still hear that ringing in my ears right now. And it's not that I don't like that song. It's not that it's the most, replaceable song on the record. But unfortunately, that was a fun show. I'm glad I got to see R.E.M. at one point in my life, but I can still hear that motherfucker yelling 9-9 in my ear. And so I'm going to have to lose it because of that.
That is hilarious. The craziest part of that story to me is the fact that you've only been to the Forum once, when it is probably one of the venues that I've been to the most in my life. So we'll have to dig deeper.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Wasn't that more of like a rock and roll? That's where Priest and Halen played back in the day, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't, they didn't have a lot of like, they didn't have a lot of what I was looking for at that point in my life. So.
And when they remodeled it, and it's a pretty great venue these days, we're obviously long gone. So yeah, maybe that does make sense.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Purely timing. So. Same thing with the Troubadour that you guys love. That when I was growing up there, it was a pay to play crap hole. So, right. Timing's everything in life.
Indeed. All right, boys. I think we did it. We talked about R.E.M. I'm glad we finally we finally cracked the Athens seal. I suspect we will get back to them again at some point, but it will not be next week. At least I don't think it will be next week. Rodney is telling us what it's going to be next week. Rod, do you know what that record's going to be?
I do. When I initially decided on this, it was with a totally different intention, without knowing we were going to have a significant amount of time off. But we'll talk more about the details of that. I'm going to go straight into the second and only other studio LP that we have not discussed, by Joy Division, Closer. And we'll talk about the details of that decision and all that when we get on the air next week. But that's what I would like to host.
Awesome. That will be a lot of fun. Look forward to that. In the meantime, check out huntsmanhill.com for past episodes. Send comments and suggestions to huntsmanhillpodcast@gmail.com. Check us out on Instagram and X. Check out our music, Academy OC, America 68, Mid-City 3, Man Hunts Man. And of course, check out the HHPP Spotify playlist, where you will now hear Radio Free Europe from R.E.M's Murmur for all of the reasons that Rodney earlier explained. It's just an absolute gem. So check it out. And we hope now to be back onto a more regular weekly schedule again, as hopefully some of the chaos in our respective lives has dissipated. And we'll be back next week for episode 272 to talk about Joy Division. Thanks, guys. That was a lot of fun. Glenn, I'm glad you could join us, although belated.
Thanks for waiting for me. Good to meet you.
Thanks, everybody.
Anytime. All right, boys. See ya.